Thank you, Bill. So tonight we have a great program, sort of two parts program. We've got the next generation doing a great job on history, and we've got one of the members here to tell us about it. Most people in Oxford have heard about it, Beardsley tomb, Little Merritt's tomb up in the Beardsley Cemetery, but most people don't know much about it. In fact, a lot of people can't even tell me where it is. You might know, well, it's somewhere past Lanfear's house, and that's about it. You know, that's about as much as people know. Well, this young fellow got interested in it, high school senior now, right, Stephen? And he has done a tremendous job from top to bottom, including scut work up there, cleaning the place up and learning the whole cemetery and recording the names and doing the research on the cemetery and the family. And Stephen Foster is here to tell us about this. And he's going to tell us about the research and the work he's done and the book that he's written and is already a bestseller in Shenango County. Stephen Foster.
I'd like to thank Fred for inviting me to come down here to give you a little presentation about what I've done with the cemetery. Again, if you're an Oxford resident especially, more than likely you've heard the story of Little Merritt and his grave with a window in it. And a lot of times when I talk with people from the area, that's as far as it goes. Oh yeah, that's the grave with a window in it. So when I first heard that story when I was 9, like most generations, it was my grandparents and my parents. Somehow we got on the topic and they said, "Did you ever hear this story?" I said no, and I didn't believe them. So we drove, and like Fred said, not many people know where it is. My parents thought they did, but didn't. And so we were driving probably an hour and a half through all over the side of the county trying to find it, and we did eventually. And when I saw it, I was sort of amazed that something so out of the ordinary was sitting in Oxford, and it stuck with me. So I went back a lot throughout the years, and it was last summer that I went back and saw the tomb in similar shape. I'm sure most of you have heard about all the vandalism and all the troubles that have went on in the cemetery. So when I went, the glass, like a lot of other times previously, was shattered and was sitting on top of the tomb, and it was just grown over, and the whole cemetery was in rough shape with broken stones, and you could see lawnmower scratches, weed eater marks over several of the stones. So it was in really, really poor shape, like most of the older cemeteries in the county are. But the first thing at the time, I had no knowledge about how do you restore gravestones. That's not my area of expertise. Well, it wasn't. And also, I'm lucky to have, if you look in the gray sweatshirt, Kurt, who I'm going to talk about, who actually has been with me restoring the entire cemetery, and Vicki House, I'm sure you all know her too, the town historian. So both of them were also huge parts of this. So I stopped to myself and I wanted to think, how do I get this window replaced was my first thing. I thought, okay, I'll somehow get a new window and that'll be the end of it. So I had called it was Jerry Locke. I looked online for the town board or anyone that was who I thought, okay, who would give me permissions for this, who should I reach out to? And they decided that they would pay to get a new window installed. And so it was going to be about a month before that happened. So I got thinking, well, we don't want to put a new window in while it's so dirty. Why don't we clean it? And a lot of people that go in and want to clean things will use things you're not supposed to, bleach, anything that will get the job done. But I was able to stop and think, okay, well, I'm sure that's not what you should do. So I looked, okay, who can clean the tomb? And that's when I started reaching out through Facebook to see, okay, who in the area can clean gravestones. And it was Kurt from One Stone at a Time. He had reached out to me at first and said, hey, we'd love to be a part of this project. I'll work with you on whatever funding you have, because I had a I remember exactly, it was $130 I had gotten in donations from people when they found out what I was doing. So then they came along and cleaned the tomb, and then it was time to put the new window in. And by the time both had been done, it was clean and the new window was in, I thought, wow, the tomb looks so much better. And this was also after days and hours of just work, simple things that anyone could do, just raking and carrying dead limbs off gravestones and just, like Fred said, just scut work, hours of it. And so at the time I was satisfied with what had been done, and then it was approaching the winter, and I thought, well, there's one stone that's complete, there's one little piece of the cemetery, that's what everyone knows it about, that's what everyone goes there for. But if you look around the rest of the cemetery, there's piles and piles of dead limbs, and almost every stone in there is broken. So that's what inspired the book, because when I put together the research I had done, because if I had gotten so interested in just Little Merritt, I wanted to learn about his family, and then I wanted to learn about the cemetery and the history, and that really started my path into local history. It's really roots in my first trip to this tomb, and then it sort of escalated into more cemeteries, more everything. But so I really wanted to get beyond just Little Merritt, and so that led me to start going to like the research centers and the family rooms. So, well, can I see this census record, and can I see this map from this year, and really got me looking into it. So when I had all that information together, I had interviewed people to get their first-hand accounts on what happened with the vandalism in the 70s, what happened then, where is Merritt now? All those questions that so many people have, I had the answers to. So I thought, okay, well, I have all this information now, and the cemetery is still in shambles, so what can I do to change that? So I thought, okay, well, I put a book out, because by the time I had started writing the book, I think there were about 500 Facebook likes on what I had started, so it showed that there's still a lot of community interest and support in the idea. So then it led into, well, today it's I think 5 away from 800. But I thought if there was enough community support and involvement, I could put a book out, like, because when you really look, there's hundreds and hundreds of local books on everything. So I thought, well, I could do one. And so that's when I really sat down with Vicky, and we thought, well, how can we make this a reality and not just an idea? And so I just put all my research together, and I wrote down what I did from day one and interviewed other people. What are your thoughts? What have you done? It's led me to meet people that were a part of 4-H groups that fixed the window back in the 40s. So I have all this, and I put it in a book, and after editing, it was about 6 months of it, I put the book out. The first release I did with it was at Bartles. It was a horrible weekend for weather. I figured that out of the entire year, the weekend I decided I'm going to put my book out, it's a downpour. But it was okay, because I bought one of those pop-up tents, but of course that had holes in it as soon as I took it out. And so it was one thing after another, but it was still amazing that I had sold, in a couple of hours, I think I was there from 8 until noon, I sold over 80 books in that one morning, because that's how much people in the community were still caring and supportive of the idea. And then I've been to a couple other places, and then just through online requests and things, to date I've sold over 250, and I released it in August. And the main thing with the book, it wasn't so I could have like the local fame or best-selling, because the idea of it is all the proceeds from the book are in a joint account that I'm signed on with the town of Oxford. So far we've already raised and went past how much money it would take to go in and fix every single stone in the cemetery. And there's also, from even before the marked burials, where you see the sunken graves and the 2 stones marking it, there's, I want to say, I don't have an exact number, around 10, maybe a few less, a few more. But we also have enough money to pay to get little blue stone markers saying unknown burial, so people know that someone is buried there. It's not just a dip in the ground. So to date, the cemetery, it's not done now because the season's come to an end, but we're anticipating by the end of next summer that you'll be able to go in and see the entire cemetery back up. And that's, I think that's really why the community was supportive of the idea, because it's not me pocketing anything and trying to just get my name, look at what I did, because it's showing that it's really going back into the cemetery, and the proof's going to be next summer when you can walk in and see everything that was in shambles from the 50s until last year back up and cared for. So there's my 10 minutes and my spot.
You did well.
Thanks.
Isn't that a good story though? You're already glad you came, right? And you're just getting into the program. And I know you've learned something from this young man. I'm very admiring of him and appreciative of him. And his friend Kurt too. That's quite a team you have there. So thank you very much.
Can I
Now
get
this book, if someone wants the book, how do you get the book?
If
Have it
you
at
want a
Bartles?
book, yeah, if you want a book, Vicky usually carries some. Bartles has some. ES Graphics has some, and then in Norwich, Seasons Gift Shop, Solstice, the Whole Food Store, the Cut Above, the Hair Salon, and also the Hair Care Center in Oxford, and the Shenango County Museum, and then also at the end or now whenever I have them with me. So.
Very good.
I just had a question or an idea. If people paid a certain amount, like maybe you could take a group there, if it was a small group, like when it was all restored, this might be the kind of people you'd want to
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah, and we're also hoping that between now and then, maybe not to do cleaning or actual gravestone work, but as far as brush and scut work, to maybe get a community day where people can go in, I can talk about it, give a little thing, and then they can be a part of the progress by, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you again, Sam, for the whole project. Thank you for all your work. By the way, we claim him as an Oxford son because his father was an Oxford young man. So that's Oxford blood there, I think. So you're already glad you came, and you'll be even gladder after a few minutes here, because we have Anna Stark and her team who know all about the east side, and I don't really know just what their focus is going to be. I just don't. But this is an audience participation program. I'm looking madly at her. Here she is. And I just don't know how they've organized it, but I guarantee you'll go out of here knowing more about the east side than you know right now. And you may have brought up your own story. You may have asked a question and brought out something. Right? I'm sure you're going to enjoy this program. So Anna and her friends.
The program tonight will be mostly by my friends, because I know very little about the east side. Although I grew up in Oxford, all I really remember growing up was you either lived over town or you lived on the side by the school, which was not the nicer side. And all I really remember was it was noisy. I had friends that lived on the end of Green Street, and so whenever I wanted to go to their house, I'd cut down Mechanic Street and then quickly go up Water Street and go to the end of Green Street. Because that whole area down there, which the three gentlemen are going to talk about, I think to most people, if they were like 4th or 5th or 6th grade, it was noisy. And at night it was very dark and spooky. They didn't have lights on the buildings like they do now. So I think a lot of people avoided it. And the pictures, or the cutouts that I gave you right here, I have to admit that, growing up here, I think I knew about the feed and fuel place, and I knew there was a railroad station, but all that stuff in between, the coal house and all that stuff, I don't think most people knew it was there. The sawmill was very loud, and I think most kids kind of avoided it. Well, maybe the boys went in there and did stuff, but I think most people just avoided it at all costs. But we have three really good presenters tonight, people who grew up either doing something that was connected with all those buildings or grew up next to the buildings. But they've got some really good stories, really interesting stories. I think most people would be surprised to know that that whole area there, which is on this, employed over 100 people between all the businesses that were there. I think most people in Oxford, it was just something that was there, but they really didn't know anything about it. So Bob, do you want to start?
Okay.
Bob's got a lot of interesting little anecdotes, so we'll ask him to start.
I'll run through it a little fast, and then if you've got any questions. First of all, this is a great picture. With the coal sheds, people that don't remember that, a lot of you do, but the train would push the cars, and I think you're going to talk a little bit about that anyway. So, but they'd push the coal cars up and open the hopper, and the whole carload of coal would drop out. Thank the book on the grave of the young boy. I remember my grandfather took me over there when I was about 10 years old and showed me that grave, and I'd never ever been back till he came out with a book, and I read the book, and the next day I went back over to but if you want a great Christmas present for your grandchildren or teenagers, this is a great thing for that. I'm going to just start at the end of Green Street, the village limits, and kind of sweep up through Albany Street and up to the end of Albany Street, and tell you a little bit about what went on back in mainly in the 40s. Starting out, Landers, Dave Landers and his mother had a poultry farm just inside the village limits. Later on, that was Mr. and Mrs. Averish fled Germany, where they had owned a large factory and were really well-to-do people. Basically left everything except a little furniture and came and bought the Landers poultry farm, and they had it for several years. They got up to in the 50s or early 60s, probably at the end of the late 50s. They got up to about 12,000 chickens, all on the floor. They had 3-story chicken houses. In fact, one on the east side of the road, up on the bank, that you'd never know now that there was, but that was the last house they built, and that was 3 stories, and I think there was 1,000 chickens on each floor. And they employed a couple people. They were unbelievable workers themselves, as most German immigrants, or most immigrants period that came over were. Then we came to the barn where the silo still stands. When we were kids, that was Ed Jones's. And later on, Ed sold the farm and started Oxford Motors. But when I was growing up, in fact, when he had his auction, he had a one-eyed cow, and that was his best cow, but she only had one eye. And he always said that his wife threw a stone at it, and that's why. And Then Arthur Butts was there for a while. Then the Borden's milk plant was employed probably 20 or 30 people at least. A lot of kids that were growing up, going to school, worked there in the summer and covered vacations. And that was all canned milk, but then they did put on the first bulk truck. And Vinnie Weidman and my dad we had the first bulk tanks and first bulk milk to go into the Borden's plant here. I'm not just sure what year that was, but it probably was very early 60s. It may have been before that. Across from where you go into Borden's was the little store. And I grew up on Mechanic Street, so that was kind of nice and handy. I remember we'd go down and get milk and bread when I lived there, but there was two stores on this side, Wichella's up on top of the hill on the corner, which sold gas, but also was a little store.
Penny candy.
Yeah. And I can't remember the lady, later on, Ray Davis bought the little store and kept it open, but for probably 30 years it was ran by a lady that lived there in the back.
Matheson?
Matheson.
Yeah, Mrs. Matheson. Also across from the little store and right next to the entrance to the milk plant was a calf yard. All the farmers brought their calves when they brought their milk to town. They put their calves on the milk truck and drop them off at Paul Dressler's calf yard. Some days he was from Scranton, had a slaughterhouse in Scranton, and drove up here 2 days a week. And had the calf yard open until noon, but he wanted to get there by noon because he loaded them on and headed south at noon. But some days there'd be 40, 50 calves. His office was the little round railroad shanty that used to sit there. And it's still right there by Borden's. It's the same one. It was a round building that was probably 8 feet across, 10 feet across. Had a potbelly stove in the middle. He went around the stove, and then he had a little 6x6 addition where he had his desk, and sometimes you had trouble getting in there in the wintertime because everybody'd go in and get a little bench around the outside and everybody sit around the potbelly stove to keep warm. But the other thing was that everybody went to see their friend at Paul Dressler's, and his name was Pete Ingram. And anybody in town, I'm sure, remembers Pete. He was a friend of everybody's, and always was there helping Paul Dressler get the calves loaded. And they had a scales there, and you put them in the scales, shut the gate, and weigh them, and go in, and he'd pay you for the calves. As we went around towards the end of Mechanic Street, just down at the end of the street, starting down towards where the Vault Company is now, Lee Williams had a farm, little farm there that went from that street to the river. Maybe you remember being out on the athletic fields, and there was a fence, probably 2/3 of the way down of where it goes now, and the cows would be there. That was his pasture for his cows. So all through the 40s and into the early 50s, that was Lee Williams's farm. And then on down farther, where the Vault Company now is, was Moon's Feed Store. And at about that time, there were 3 feed stores on the east side of Oxford, the village of Oxford. Mr. Potter from McDonough, Ken and George Potter's father, ran the feed store. I remember it well because, like the Vault Company does, it flooded, and my dad would get a call in the afternoon and say, you know, looks like the flood's coming, we gotta get all the feed out of the feed store. So Dad would get through chores, and most of the night they'd load all the feed up, and load after load, all the bag feed. And to this day, I never did ask my dad where they took it. I was always there, quite often there when they were loading it, but then it got late at night, so they took it on somewhere on high ground, and then a couple days later, they'd bring it all back, put it back in the feed store. Mr. Buckland was on the other side of the driveway from the calf yard, and he had a sharpening shop. And he sharpened all the farmers' tools, our chopper knives we'd take off, and he had a jig there that he'd sharpen all the tools. Starting down Green Street, on the far side of the street, where Donnie Golden used to have his business.
Number 14, I think.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
had a little trouble. It's going the opposite way for me, maybe if it was on this side it would be. You can look at this later, and here's a map, an older map, but that was a coal yard. Up and back, there was places, kind of bunks like where he stored the coal, and he had a pretty good coal business. When my dad sold his fuel company, or his trucking business, he had a small fuel business and was an SO dealer or agent for this area, for Oxford. And every morning, Saturday morning, we'd drop a tank on a flatbed, 1-ton flatbed, and deliver kerosene to all the houses. A good share of the house. Nobody had central heating, basically back in the 40s, and most people had just kerosene heaters, and they'd have a little storage for. So my dad would deliver that, and up in Blue Ox's offices is an SO calendar, I think from 1934, Marshman SO dealer. And when he sold the business, went back to the farm, he sold the fuel business to George Pay. And George Pay was going to go from coal and also have fuel. Well, he only had it a year or so, and it really wasn't working out, so he sold the fuel business to Ken Thompson. And then later on, Emerson's bought it, and it became Blue Ox. So I know up in their offices they've got a calendar of my dad's and a calendar of Ken Thompson's before it became Blue Ox. Right across from George Pay's was the sawmill, and you wouldn't even think there was ever a sawmill right in the middle of Green Street. Part of the building is still there. They built a house. One of the owners, when they closed the sawmill down, the Sanford brothers built a house there. But originally, when I was real small, the sawmill was owned by Bob Race, which was one of the Race brothers, Russell and Bob, and Barb Race's brother. And then eventually it became Sanford Brothers. They were from over around Sydney, and they were building a lot of barns. In fact, all of our single-story barns that we had on the farm were all built by the Sanford Brothers. And they took all the logs out of our woods, brought them all up to Green Street, sawed them all, and then went and built the barns. So sometimes they had that sawmill going pretty regularly. Then we're up to where Feed and Fuel, as most of you remember, is Feed and Fuel. The feed store and another coal dealership. In the early days, they were a pretty big coal dealer. They could get the coal in on the trains, and they had the coal silos that they could elevate, came augured out underground or just above the ground, and then they had an elevator, 4 silos, and an elevator which is still there between the cups and the chains and everything are still there where those 4 silos are still there, and the internal chain and buckets to get little small like hand buckets that would go up and go over and dump it in, and then they could go from either one of the silos, and then up about 8-10 feet it was just dirt or coal or something in the bottom, but then they had a chute so they could fill their trucks. They'd back their trucks up and just open it up, and the coal would flow from those silos right into their delivery trucks. But when I was a kid, it was Halleck's Feed and Coal, and Mr. Halleck was main residence was in Texas. I'm not sure just how or why he was here. He would be here in the summertime, but they had some kind of orchards or groves in Texas. So about September, October, he would leave and go to Texas for the summer. And he had a couple sons, Dave Halleck, who was his senior year in high school. He wanted to graduate from Oxford, and so he lived with my grandparents his senior year. In fact, the other day I found a picture of him standing, waiting for the bus to go to school. And just in the last month or so, he called Kathy McKenzie and talked with her. He's in California and still alive. He had a younger brother, Franny Halleck, who was a really good football player and very fast. He ended up a track scholarship to Texas A&M and won the hurdles in the Pan Am Games back when the Pan Am Games were a big deal. But when Mr. Halleck was ready to go to Texas, herded the family in the car and away they went. Didn't matter what was going on or anything. That date they went. Well, both Oxford and Sherburne were undefeated. Sherburne had a really good team and had a guy by the name of Bobby Ellis that was really fast. Had all the records for the 100-yard dash, and it was going to be a big game. And about Tuesday, Mr. Halleck says, "Okay, we're going back to Texas." So Franny got in the car and left, and I think both teams were 4-0, and he never got, and we didn't do very well in that game. But later on, he did make a name for himself at Texas A&M. Then it was purchased by Herm Adams, who had the farm where the Lock Farm is, up by Buckley Hollow. Herm had sold the farm and bought the farm just before the blinker light on up Albany Street, the one on the right. But he was mainly going to run the feed store. He had it a few years, and then it was purchased by Brown and Knapp. When Herm had it, they had one of his employees fell into the feed bin and suffocated, and I think that pretty much ended Herm Adams' interest in the feed mill, and may very logically have maybe put him out of business if he hadn't sold it. I don't remember what the circumstances were, but shortly after that, he did sell it to Brown and Knapp. Right across from Feed and Fuel was GLF store. They also had a siding. That siding, they came from the north, backed the cars down in to beside the feed store. Malcolm Hill, Francis Hill's brother, owned the GLF store, and he also used later on when the freight pretty well stopped. He also used a freight house for feed after all the freight stopped going through there. Just one other little business that was under the old fire station. Ones that remember the fire station there was a blacksmith shop on the river side underneath that, and I don't remember the gentleman's name. There was two blacksmiths, one there and also one over just behind the dollar store where that long driveway goes back. And I think that was Maribel Ford's father that had that blacksmith shop. But I remember bringing stuff up to the blacksmith there under the fire station.
That wasn't a code?
No, I don't think it was. No. Yep.
I think the co-house was over the blacksmith. I think the co-house was over the blacksmith.
Well, the co-house is the one that's still there.
Yeah.
Right here beside the
Right,
library.
but I think.
But I don't remember what Mr. Coe did.
No, but I think the co-house was over the blacksmith, I think.
Yeah. Well, when they put the ag shop, or one of the shops, and did the 54 addition, or, no, it wasn't, it was after we were out. So were they doing it when we were in school, Dan?
Which one?
The new addition on the school.
No, we were in.
But I remember we went over there, I think in junior high maybe, and had our shop classes over down under in that, where the blacksmith was. And it was pretty rough. It was the dirt floor. It wasn't anything very fancy, but he had a blacksmith shop there for several years. Going on up where Danny Spencer is, that was a big part of town. Of course, back way before me was the basket factory was up in that area. And if you have a chance and don't know much about the basket factory, you really ought to read about it. They were making 5,000 bushel baskets a day, filling 2 railroad cars a day, and employing 200 people, and bringing the logs in and cutting the logs up, and it was a big deal. The Shenango Co-op milk plant was there, and that was kind of people that went to the co-op really didn't think much of the Dairyman's League people that were going to Borden's, and vice versa. It was a pretty dividing where your milk went back in those days. Right beside the co-op milk plant was John Shepler's International Truck. business, which was before he moved over where Ken Ryan's is. And he didn't sell cars till he got over on that place, but he sold international trucks, and he sold a lot of trucks. And the main reason that he had a pretty substantial business wasn't because of John, I always say, it was because of Bridge. Bridge really ran the place for Father, even back in those days. It was now Bridge Falston, but back then was Bridge Gutler. But I remember during the war, my dad's truck that he picked up all the garbage with and delivered the freight broke a clutch, and they took it up to Shepler's, and they were going to weld it on, and the truck caught on fire and burned the truck up. All the inside the cab and all the wiring. And we had a small 1-ton truck that we did but it took them like 3 months. You couldn't buy a truck of any kind. There was just no wartime. There was just no civilian trucks available. And it took them about 3 months to get that all rewired and back so we could use it. Also, a little later was, and that's a little after Shepler's moved out, it was a Worthmore feed store. Bill Clark, Cassie's father, had the feed store there, and that was the third feed store. There was Moon's, or fourth. There was Moon's, Halleck's, GLF, and Worthmore. There was 4 feed stores just on this side of Oxford. I think when Worthmore's feed store was closed, then Paul Kelly had a machine shop there where the feed store was. I don't think they were both there at the same time. Wachella's store is up on the corner. And I'll just come back to the railroad station. Dale and I both lived close to the railroad station, just across the street. And there was the station master was Lib Coleman. I just read the first article in one of those books that just came out today, and it's about a gentleman that in the 30s was station master, must be before Lib Coleman. And in the first,
That was O&W, I think, wasn't it?
oh yeah, that was he was up the O&W. But I remember when my dad would deliver freight, I'd stay with Lib Coleman. He had his big high seats there to sell tickets, passengers tickets. I always called the other high seat there next to him, that was my seat. So. But I spent a lot of time and you know, one of the things that's unique back then was the egg train. Every Monday, the egg train came through. And everybody that had a truck or something could bring their eggs in, and they'd line up all the passenger bag carts, and they'd fill them. There'd be 8 or 10 of them all filled with cases of eggs. And my dad would go around, he had an egg route. Early Monday morning, he'd go around to all the places that couldn't bring them. And back then, probably in the town of Oxford, there was every farm had some chickens, and probably 30 or 40 of them actually shipped some eggs. And they went in the egg car to New York City, and I have receipts, 10 years of receipts, or I had 10, I didn't keep them all, but 10 years of receipts. We'd usually send 10 or 12 cases, and it always went to Shapiro and Brooklyn. And he'd send a check and a receipt for how many large eggs, mediums, and so much. And they were like 30 cents a dozen or something, which wasn't too bad back then. Okay, I've taken enough.
A question for Bob about the sawmill. How do they power the sawmill? What size logs could they handle on the sawmill?
They could, as big as you could bring in. Yeah, I had a big circular saw, probably 36, yeah, I think 36 inch.
A gas powered or steam or something?
No, it was, I think it was electric. Yeah.
The transformer goes three-phase on that.
Yeah, it was three-phase. They put three-phase in there.
So anyway, I'm not in charge here, so I don't know who's coming next here, but, I know that they both have good stories.
Pat, you wanna go next?
Gene Rood,
Pat, you wanna go?
I know once you get Gene going, then you have lots of stories. It's kinda hard to get him going maybe.
I'd have been prompt to it. I didn't realize I was part of the show tonight.
Didn't know?
What?
It was all over Oxford's.
Patrick Lewis Moore's grew up, I'm trying to think, it's about a 7-iron shop out here, right down the street. And so he has lots of stories from this neighborhood. When he's with me, he's talked a mile a minute, he tells me stories, so tell us some of those stories about the,
I'll try to. It's a little impromptu. I didn't expect I was talking tonight. I grew up down on Merchant Street next to the railroad tracks, like Fred had said. And, it was a good neighborhood. It was dark, I guess. I don't know. I never noticed it. We, were forever throughout those buildings, the feed companies, the coal bins, the creamery. And, I always had my eye on the train. I was always a train buff. So I'd watch every move that they made. The highlight of the year would come when I was a kid, would come 3 times. And it would be what's now Camp Sora, and it would be when their campers came up from New York City. And to this day, I don't remember how we knew. But we knew it was gonna be the day the train came. And half the kids in town would be right over there in front of my house and up and down next to the depot. And we'd be waiting and going around the corner and looking down by the milk plant to see if the train was coming. Finally, one of the kids would scream out that it was coming. And we'd all run over there and see a real passenger train. That was something we didn't ever see around here. And of course, all the wagons and trucks and carts and stuff from the North Pond would be down, and the kids would all load up, and they would go up, and then the train would come back, halfway through the summer with a smaller load of kids, and they'd do a switch swap. Some would go up and some would leave. And then the last time, the train would come empty and take the last of them home. And that used to be quite a highlight. Then, almost straight in back of me, on the main street, right next to the dike, right next to the Congregational Church, I think it's the United Church of Oxford today, or whatever they call it, big, giant 3-story house when I was a kid. I think it's still here in one of these pictures somewhere. I can find it. No, I don't see it in these pictures, unfortunately. But anyway, big, giant 3-story house, and that was planted right in front of our playground. There was a dike there, and on the dike we would sled in the winter. We'd go over it in the summer and go down fishing and all the things that kids did in those days. But what made that house special was it was huge and it was empty, except for one elderly lady who was always sitting in back in what was like a sun porch. You remember it, Mike. It was almost like a sun porch back there. She had all kinds of plants growing in it, and she'd be sitting there in the house cold, drinking her tea. We thought it was haunted for sure. That was always the haunted house in Oxford.
What was your name?
Morris. It was the Morris house. It's Bob, where,
Rogers,
Rogers.
Dr. Rogers and his mother.
Oh,
And
Well,
later
you know
Dr.
it was,
Rogers.
you know it was haunted.
yeah. Every place is haunted.
I wish somebody would really get the whole history of it. That was a fabulous house.
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah.
It's
The
absolutely
third
huge.
floor was a dance floor, there was stone on the first floor and in the back. The garage was better built than many houses these days. I'm not exaggerating.
Well, see, Fred, I never knew what happened to that house because I was in and out of town so much in those years. Somebody bought into that house.
Partially burned and it was
And they started putting
and
money
I
in.
never,
I mean, there was piles of plywood, new roofs, and all of a sudden, it was gone.
Bob just told you it's partially burned.
yeah, partially burned.
partially burned and it
Partially
was,
burned?
Cynthia and Bob, and Ray Rogers, who went to school, it was their father's house and that was their grandmother. And Cynthia now owns the Ontario Hotel.
Yeah,
She grew up in that house
did she really?
with her grandmother and went to school here. Her father went up around Lowville and.
She'd be throwing stones at me, I'm telling her house was haunted. She wouldn't be too pleased. But the other place in town that was supposedly really haunted was the quarry that was up in back of Pat Marx's. And there was a big bluestone quarry up there with huge pieces of stone and all kinds of stuff in it. And we used to hunt and play and camp on that hill forever. And my mother always told us they would never go there and sit and wait for deer because it was haunted. You would hear the workers knocking at the stone and talking and things like this. And I never sat up there to find out she was right or wrong. I took you up there, Fred, I showed you
You spent a
that.
good day up there, Patrick. I have pictures of that excursion.
And, I don't have a whole lot to add to that. Again, when we lived on Merchant Street, I had a neighbor straight through the back. And his name was Polly Marshman. Now, do you remember Polly?
Jamie made it.
And we used to call him, we were nasty little kids, we used to call him the Hummer. He always wore a suit, he always went, as he walked up the street. Now tell me I'm wrong, that's what he did.
You're right, absolutely.
You weren't in the
And,
best home.
The thing was, he ran a store in the firehouse somewhere. He had a little grocery store in front of the firehouse.
Right there, yeah.
Where was it, Nurse?
Well, it was on the ground floor,
Okay,
just as you're going around the corner.
okay, because my mother told me it was there, but not in my memory.
Well, later,
But
it
you-
was Jack
it
Wallace's
was-
place.
Now, was that the front where the
Part
ladies?
of the fire, not part of the firehouse, but it was that old red building that they,
Yeah.
tore down.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there was one more grocery store in
Yeah.
town. And a firehouse.
I don't know how many groceries they sold, but they sold
Oh,
a lot of.
it only came from my mother. My mother told me that story. And then if you continued out Albany Street, around the corner, and it's all changed now, of
Yeah.
course, but right there where the turn was, it took you down to the engineering plant, the WRC home. There used to be a small grocery
Yeah.
store
And
there.
they still have the Salada tea.
Do they really?
sign in the window. That's
But
what
I
they
remember
were.
that, because I used to walk all the way out that road every night with the Binghamton Press.
Yep.
Used to carry X number of those to the home to deliver.
Debbie Taylor lived there,
Yep.
Debbie and Rosemary. They still had that sign in the window.
I
Sort of
didn't,
a paint, it's like. it was
still
colored.
says Salada Tea.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
yeah.
I just knew it was a grocery store then,
Yeah.
when John Wachella had his store.
The little house.
Well, that's about all I got, Fred, at the moment.
Thank you, Patrick. But trust me, if you ask him a question, there'll be another chapter to it when we get later. Thank you very much, Patrick.
You're welcome, sir.
I can just add one thing, he talked about the going to the camp. back then, we literally, everybody, I don't think there was any Jewish people in Oxford. I don't.
Why, of course there was.
There was a few, well, yeah, black, Dave Black.
There was the Blacks, the Kesslers, the...
But we always called it the Jew camp. I mean, everybody, that was what it was. It was the Jew camp. There was no other name to it. But my dad had the trucking business, and there were no buses other than a few school buses. But my dad put, when they came in, I wrote that in part of my article on my dad's business. But one day they'd leave a freight car off, and all the trunks, each kid that came up from the city had a big trunk.
Oh, yeah.
So we took all the trunks to the camp, and then the next day the passenger train would come. My dad would put bales of hay on his truck, and he'd usually try to get some other truck from somewhere that he had the only truck that was here in town, so he had to get somebody. He tried to have 2 trucks, and they'd load up kids on those bales of hay and take them to the. And if he had, I think if there was 2 trucks, it was either 3 or 4 trips. Otherwise, it was 7 or 8 trips. It'd take 3-4 hours to get all the kids up there, and then in the fall. It was like the Thursday before 4th of July, July 4th when they came in, and they went back the Thursday before Labor Day, I think, and the whole thing happened the other way. He'd put some hay around and load the kids in there, and they'd sit on the bales of hay and he'd take them up.
But I got to comment on what Bob said, because he's absolutely right. It was called the Jew train, but Oxford was a strange, and that was a strange world when I grew up here. Because I had to grow up, leave school, get a job, and go out in the world to discover what racism was and what prejudice was. It didn't matter who, we all knew the various, we had interracial marriages, we had war brides, we had black people that worked at the bank, that were the star of the football team, that were a great basketball player. As kids, we were all Cub Scouts. We all went up to Camp Tuscarora. One father at a time would sit in the lean-to while we had a fire. All the other fathers, didn't matter what color they were down the lodge, Penny a Point, playing pitch. Didn't matter. And I had to get out in the world to discover that you weren't supposed to like somebody because of something. And that was kind of strange. And I'm sure that was a light feeling for a lot of us that grew up in Oxford. People were just people, and we were all friends. And then you came to a nice town, young man.
I've always said that. I've always said that. You've heard me at meetings say, I think I love this town more than some of the people who were born and raised here.
I wouldn't doubt it. You came to a nice town.
I love this community, and I extol it here and when I'm away somewhere else, I really do. And I just know some great people here, and I've heard some great stories, now all of which I repeat. And, I want to get Gene up here, and because Gene has a very, he's an engineer, he's well known as an engineer from West Point across central New York State. If you wanted to have a really good clerk of the works or community town engineer, this is the guy to go to. But he also was a kid in this neighborhood, and I've heard some things about that. And I don't know just what he'll tell us, but Gene, would you just tell us something about the old days when you were a kid on the east side?
You're gonna be younger than his days.
I had to get rid of half my stories because Dale's here.
Incrimination?
Rather than go into any type of order, I just jotted down some stuff. And so I'm gonna go here and there because I'm not very organized. So how we end this thing, I don't know. You probably have to get a sheep so it can haul me out of here. But I'll start up at the vet's home. When you started mentioning the coal cars, the vet's home also ran on coal. And they had a ramp on as you're facing the old building, which is now gone. They went up to the left and they dropped the coals in the hopper there, and then they actually had 3 coal-fired boilers there. And that's how my dad got started. He was a stationary engineer there. And then later on it went to oil, and they had to, they used number 6, and that's pretty cold stuff, so they have to, back then they had to throw steam into those oil tanks to keep it liquid enough so they could fire. And then the nozzles were, I shouldn't be talking engineer talk. The nozzles created the spray which ignited it. And those boilers would put out, let's see, they were 125 PSI, so they were probably 150 pound boilers. They had 3 of them, 2 side by side and 1 single. So anyway, one of the things I wanted to mention is, I don't know if you folks remember the original Vets home. It was the brick, say Victorian brick. Coincidentally, when I was in Montana, I was doing a HUD job out there, and they had hired an architect to come and work with us, because I'm on the engineer side of the house. And we got BSing at the bar up there in Cutbank, Montana, and it turns out he was one of the contract administrators for the middle Vets home. And we got talking about it, and he quit right after that was done, and I said, well, why did you do that? And the reason was that he was with the company that did the design for the state, and he wanted to just rehab that building and bring it up to code. And obviously the state didn't listen, so we have what we have today. But that was an absolutely fabulous structure, absolutely fabulous. And as a kid, I played in the tunnel from the powerhouse up to the old hospital and did all that nonsense. And now if a kid did that, they'd throw your parents in jail. So anyway, and I was going to mention there, but I tell you, there's some truth in it. Other than that, it's going to be a story. One of the things that as an engineer, that really interested me, on the corner of Merchant and Mechanic Street, a gentleman by the name of George Carlson. And he was a Danish engineer, and he worked for, now it's GE, but it used to be GLA, and I can't remember what it was before that. But that house, it's in the it's this house right here. What's on that corner today is a single story. And what old George did, when his family left, he decided, I don't need a second story. So he literally had the roof built on the inside, on the second floor, and then when the roof was completed, tore the top off. That's how they got to be. Fabulous guy, had a very thick accent, and he had two sons and a daughter. All 3 of them were just brilliant folks, and I went to school with John Carlson, the middle one, and he was a genius as far as I'm concerned. Just a fabulous guy. As Bob mentioned, we had 3 feed stores when I knew him, and my father-in-law, Bill Clark, had the one Worthmore Feeds, and then Brown and Knapp had a feed store that, where am I at? Over here. And then the story I like to tell there is my grandparents were from Switzerland originally. And when I was a little kid, my mother made fantastic molasses cookies. You couldn't get any better than those. And every once in a while she'd give me the bucket and say, go down to Brown and Knapp and get molasses. Well, I did that for, I don't know, a year or so. And one of the 2 guys asked me what I was, taking the molasses for. And I said, oh, my mom makes cookies. Well, that's the last time I could get molasses down there, because that was cattle feed. So
All the farm wives used to have molasses for cookies.
Yeah, I know, it just makes you wonder. So, and I have to tell tales on my dad, of course. We lived on 7 Merchant Street, which is right off the end of Mechanic Street here, and Mr. Hill had the feed store. And as a kid, I used to play in those until he'd run us off again. Ocean hadn't fit, but one of the things that happened is Mr. Hill had a lot of cats. And Mr. Brigham owned the house that you folks lived in before you got there. And he had this little Model A Ford pickup. And my dad got tired of the cats.
That was different.
Brigham had it first.
Okay, we called him the kitty man.
Yeah, well, you're close. Anyway, my dad got tired of the cats, so he raised up one of the bedroom windows, whipped out his .22, and he got the cat. He also got my neighbor's tire, and the neighbor's tire, Mr. Brigham's tire. So Mr. Brigham came out to my dad the next day basically and said, I didn't mind you shooting the cat, but you shot my tire too. So, but I have lots of stories on my dad I can tell, but, well, actually, he can't do anything to me anymore. 'Cause he's So, the thing I liked about the boarding plan is you're right. I used to work there summers and weekends, and a guy by the name of Howie Stillware was a kid, and he and I worked out on weekends and summers. And they had an ice plant there that put out 200-pound blocks. And in those days, the milk was brought in bulk. We had 2 bulk tanks on the left-hand side as you're looking at the plant. And then we had 2 or 4 milk separators. And so we would ship a carload of skim milk to Jersey City. And then Howie and I'd have to load all the cream cans onto the truck and pack that with ice. And and Bob, maybe you can help me, there was one farm that came in here that had, its milk came in as probably as yellow as your sweater. And the butter fat would have been, I don't know, can you tell me? I know Holsteins were 2 to 4,
Yeah.
but this stuff.
There weren't many Jersey, there was probably a Guernsey, there were some Guernsey herds.
Well, it was lucky that any of his milk got processed because we'd all scurry around and grab up a gallon or 2 every day. So that's the kind of outfit that was there when I was there. And there weren't that many boarding plants or employees there when I was there, but Sid Rook was the foreman there, and Doug Root was the mechanic. And we had old 3-phase kick flywheel motors that ran that ice plant. And when one kicked a phase, you could just feel that whole building jump. And then we'd get a hold of Emerson at that time, your dad, would come down and do his magic and make the damn things work. So, you also had mentioned Shepler's Garage. When that burnt, I was a small kid and I was on the dike that you had just mentioned. And they had welding models in there, of course. And that fire got really hot. And the next thing I heard was a bang. And an O2 bottle went straight up in the air. And I mean, it couldn't have gone up any better than if it had been fired by a cannon. Did a flop and came right back down on the same side. And to this day, I can remember that. I mean, it was just like a rifle shot going up. And I can't tell you how far up it was, but it made my head bend. And then Shepler's was no more there. But Mr. Kelly and Dad had the feed store there at about the same time. And then they'd have to pinch the cars. I have to add to the Jewish camp story. As a kid, we'd watch them, and by that time, they were using buses to haul the kids back and forth. But I had a friend of mine who used to mow lawns up there, and he loved his job. And I said, well, what's so great about going up there and mowing lawns? And he said, well, the girls up there are less than modest. I was a little young, but I did figure it out. And the other thing I mentioned was, I think most of you remember Chet Stork.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I certainly do.
Yeah. Well, I got my first red hat from Chet Stork because he thought I needed one, and then when he passed away, I actually put one in his coffin. So, but
We have one of his hats in the museum.
oh, did you? Yeah, he was a craftsman. He just couldn't be beat. But I don't know if you know much about the house, but it's got a barrel vault for basement, and I got my first strong taste of hard cider there. Could hardly get out of the place. And I got my first taste of Between the Axe cigars. And his grandfather used to smoke these little buggers that were about like that, and they were blacker than your sweater. And we went down, old Chet built a small cabin down there where the pond used to be. We used to ice skate on that. And John and I got smoking those things. And the two of us tried to get out the door at the same time because it just wasn't gonna work. I remember that to this day. I guess I am gonna tell some stories on my dad. He had an old 1948 Packard. He loved that car more than my mom, I think. And my brothers and I, well, it's kind of fortunate that my dad is 96 because he lived through both of us. But I had decided that I'd play a joke on him and I put a smoke bomb in his Packard. And every morning his routine was to get out, pet the old cat, get in the car, start it up, go up to the vet's home. Well, my brother and I were on the second floor waiting for this event. And sure enough, my dad turned the key, hit the starter button, and there was a big whistle and a loud boom! And smoke come boiling out of the car. And my dad actually got through the window. The sad part is he saw my brother and I. And the rest wasn't so funny. But, anyway, you remember the Soapbox Derby races coming down Albany Street? Anybody remember that? Surely you must.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they moved it over on the other, and it also came down State Street.
So, and then, I'm gonna jump around here. Right across the street from the feed store that Brown and Knapp had when I was there was a family by the name of Wilcoxes. I think they were old retired farmers. And back in 40, I guess it'd be 48 to 50, somewhere in there, she paid me $10 a week to shovel coal into the hopper, mow her lawns, and plow and shovel sidewalks. I don't know about you guys, but back then, $10 was one hell of a lot of money. And he kept 3 cows in the back, which she didn't like, but he was a farmer and that's what he kept. And as a family, we kept chickens in the back of our place. I mean, that's the way it was back then.
That was, they had the farm, Ed Jones bought their farm, they had the farm down here where, at the end of Green Street.
Neat old lady, neat old lady. And then, learned how to drive. East River Road from Oxford to Norwich was?
Dirt.
You're exactly right.
Really?
Dirt road. Dirt road. And then, more recently in '06, when we had the flood here, I saw a picture of the flood, I think it was a 35. And on the railroad tracks, just in front of the, what's the house next to the Episcopal Church? What do they call that?
Parish
The parish house.
Right.
And I saw a man standing in the railroad tracks with water up to his knees, right about here. And in '06, I went with Mr. Covey, and we went and pulled a lot of the computers and brand new school books and stuff that we could from the basement floor of the school back up on the first floor. And then I started walking the town because I used to walk this area. So remembering that photo, I stood in the middle of the railroad tracks in '06 during that flood, and guess what? The water was right there. And that's another thing I'll probably never forget. I guess that's about all I can, I do have another story on my dad. My dad would never let my brother and I buy a car when we turned 16. We had to build our first car. So we had a 40 Ford frame and a 32 body, I think we strapped on it. And we had a flathead that worked. And then my baby brother decided to get something bigger, which worked better, except we kept splitting the drive shafts. And we popped the clutch and that thing would stand about 3 runs and it'd go. So my dad went down to Mr. Buckland and told him what the problem was. And Mr. Buckland built a new drive shaft for my dad to fit that car. And my brother and I never could make it break. I won't tell you how he told me it wouldn't break, but I think that's about all I can say. My fondest memories were, as a kid, were at Borden's because Sid Root and Doug both were laid-back guys. They never got nervous about anything. You could dump 10 million gallons of milk and he'd say, well, that's okay, we'll pick it up tomorrow, kind of thing. They were just super guys down here. And I'm gonna tell stories on myself. Just as the bulk tanks were coming in, a guy by the name of Green, it's the Round Barn Farm in Green. He had one of the first bulk
George
tanks.
Young.
George Young, he picked up your milk.
Yeah, and white.
And sometimes he would come in, typically on a Saturday or Sunday, he'd park the truck halfway out the road, and then Howie and I would run like hell to get in the truck and back it into the shed to unload it. And one time I beat Howie, and they had a slop load on it. So I gassed that old truck, and I zapped her in, and I hit the brakes, and everything stopped. and then the truck proceeded to slide right into the loading dock. And old Sid came out and he scratched his head, and he smoked his pipe, and he said, "Well, boys, straighten it out." I mean, today that couldn't happen, but it was just, that's just how it was. It just, I enjoyed working there, and I learned a lot of respect for the folks that worked there. And of course, when I was there, it was on the tail end, and I guess probably maybe 5 years or so later, it all closed. But, I don't know, I had a great time there as a kid, I really did. Railroad track, when I first moved here, we still had steam trains running through here. And I can remember my mom to this day complaining like mad when she hung her clothes out. And then the train would come through and she'd have to wash them all over again. So, anyway, if you got any questions, I'd be happy to answer it. If not, I'll get out of here. Very good, well, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, all of you. Do you have concluding remarks, Hannah, or? I have just one or two comments. First of all, I'd like to mention a fellow who was sitting in the front row, in the sinner's row here. He didn't know that was the sinner's row. And he's one of the authors who's contributed to one of these journals. If you remember the Tarbo Farms over in Smithville? Well, this fellow, Don Windsor, who was on the publications committee responsible for keeping these things moving and so on, is also a writer and a scholar in various interests.
He's also the one that talked me into writing my article.
Very good, yeah. And so he's here, and two or three things came up. I'd like to, Gene mentioned the heating up at the vet's home, and I'm not sure people know where that heating plant was, or what an engineering feat that was to have it down there.
Yeah.
I think some people thought you were talking about it right up at the home.
No.
Okay, explain that, will you please?
Where the well house for the vet's home is right now, go north about 150 feet, and we had the power plant there. It was brick, and the chimney was 125 feet. Because my dad used to climb that thing to check something up there. And they, as I said, they had 3 boilers. They also had their own generator, steam power generator. So when the power went out from NYSEG, well, I'll use my dad, but any steam fireman that was there would have to run down into the pit, and they had a steam turbine there, and they had, like, I'll say 5 minutes to get down and open the valve so that the boiler, all the steam that would normally go up on the hill would have to come through that turbine, and it would spool up. And it would spool up enough to get a certain RPM, and then my dad had 3 knife switches he had to pull. And once that thing got going, he'd bring the knife switches over to put power back up on the hill, and those knife switches would get about a little over halfway, and you had to get your hands loose because they'd actually slam into the keeper by themselves. And I mean, it was like a rifle going off, and you'd have all 3 of those. Most of the time they'd all go off at the same time because that's 3-phase power. But every once in a while one would click or get stuck, and it would just kind of chatter like mad and then slam in.
He's giving you the nitty-gritty of the plant there, but the steam, the heat from that power plant was used in all the buildings up there, the 5 cottages and everything up at the WRC home.
Plus
There was a
garage.
tunnel that went up through there, which I guess you could walk up
Oh,
through.
yeah, you could. It was, the
That
tunnel
that
itself
connected
was,
this, going up that hill.
yeah, the tunnel itself
That
was about
steam
6 by
turbine,
6.
by the way, was one of the very early steam turbines in the world. That was 1897, 1898. And they were just coming on the scene internationally. It was a British invention. And they were one of the very early ones. It was quite an engineering marvel, the whole process there. And this guy knows the nitty-gritty, so, and more that he couldn't tell us, I'm
I
sure.
spent a lot of time there.
And the laundry.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the laundry too.
Was down there.
Okay. I'm going to give you just two comments. I'm going to call on Vicki House in a second here, because this is a historical society, and you're supposed to go away having learned a little history. And I can't help but comment on the co-op, the milk co-op, because in the late 30s, when the milk prices were going down, 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 and dissatisfaction with Gordon's was rising, and they ended up with a milk strike here in Oxford. That was a big deal in Oxford, and the But the grudges and the feelings from that milk strike lasted for years. And I came here in the 60s, and there were some people, some farmers who still had grudges. I didn't understand why there were some men who I thought were great, who other farmers thought weren't so great. Because these guys who were taking their milk around that strike, people remember that. They really remember that. And the whole co-op, Borden's division there, as you say, it was an issue here. The other thing, I'm going to point to a building that didn't get mentioned. I'm pointing to it. Here's the feed store. Here, you know where the DL&W depot is, and across there was the coal building, and there's the feed store, McDowell and Walker. Right there is a building. It's number 14 on here. It's being used as a garage. The Place Boys have done a good job of repainting and refurbishing all the buildings there. So, but I think only 2 people in this room know what that building was originally. If you're, well, maybe I told you, maybe 3 people.
I've known that for a long time.
Oh, all right, that's 3 people. See that? That's great. Vicki, though, I'm going to call out Vicki to explain what this building is. And,
Back in the 1820s, there were 2 school districts in Oxford, number 1 and number 2. Number 1 was on the east side, and it was, this map is way off. But, thank you, Rick.
no, this is, that's my copy. So,
Okay, it's right where the shanty is right now. There was a schoolhouse there, I've got a picture of it. This schoolhouse, number 14, was up where the tennis courts were, next to McCoon's house. It was taken apart by Don Corbin. He and his wife were coal dealers, and he needed it for a coal shed because the Lackawanna Railroad used anthracite coal, which was a cleaner burning coal. So he took it apart and brought it down closer to the depot. Well, closer to the tracks then. And then they moved it over here. If you go over to the feed store today, stand in front of the feed store, look to your left, you'll see a little building down there with 2 windows. That's a schoolhouse that was built in the 1820s. And it's probably one of the oldest existing schoolhouses in Shenango County. It's in great shape, and we've talked about it. Fred and I went over and took a look, and Fred marked it off. I checked the windows.
measured it.
Yep. So we're going to try and see what we can do about getting something done with that. But that would be a rare addition to the Historical Society if we could do that. If you look at this map, you can see the schoolhouse. The one that would be here would be, hi Fred, I had it pointed out, but anyway, the schoolhouse is on here, it's right there. And it's got the 2 windows on it and everything, and it would go up the street. There's the feed store. So the other one would be diagonally across the street, next to the tracks, and it's right where the shanty is today.
Okay,
Fred, I just remembered one business I forgot.
go ahead, Bob.
Most of you know where Dick Finch lives on Green Street. Where the big square house that the roof is falling in. It's right, the next house south. Back of that's a small barn. And that was Don Moore. Don Moore had a meat market here where the stone building is by the red light. And a bakery and a meat market. And that, he slaughtered his cattle up in that barn. And in fact, I think somebody just bought, the tracks were still in that barn till recently. But the story was also that was, during the war, that was black market. That was, he brought black market cattle in there and slaughtered up in that little barn up back of where Dick Finch's is.
There are stories all over here, I'll tell you, and I like the fact that they sort of percolate up here a little bit. Maybe we should toss 1 or 2 down.
I'd like to percolate one.
Go ahead.
Since you were talking about your dad, I wanted to talk about Bob's dad. Thinking about Saturday mornings. And the reason this all comes to mind is because now with 2 grandkids, and I'm getting them in the car with car seats, they gotta be, in 5 years or whatever, they're not supposed to be, you gotta get a new one and all this. And I'm doing all this buckling and pushing in with these kids, and I'm saying, wait a minute. Blommus Marshman, Saturday mornings, would come up with the milk, and then he was gonna eat his breakfast, second breakfast perhaps, and then take us down to the farm. How did we get down there? We straddled the headlights on the front fender. I said, today, yeah, they'd throw us in jail for that. Every kid on the, well, not every kid, half a
And then
dozen
when
of
he got
us.
rid of the headlights, we still rode on the fenders.
Yeah,
And we'd ride all the way to McDonough to get a load of sawdust up at Ford's.
yeah. So,
We grew up on the fender of the trucks, I don't know why.
luckily we stayed on them.
And then Dale and I used to go down by the river in an old hay barn and bring snakes. We'd get on the headlight when we came back for lunch, we'd have a snake in each hand. Then we'd come up and chase all the kids around and
Not me.
then one day they were putting coal into the school, into the coal bin. So we threw the snakes down in the coal bin. And my dad was on the school board, and the next spring, he was over to school and I was with him. And he came out and he says, you know, we've got this whole area is all sealed. So there's no way anything could go in there. There was snakes, and when we got the coal out in the springs back in the corner, there were a bunch of dead snakes. So we can't figure out how they got in there.
Did you tell him?
No. I think my dad knew though.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to close this very formal part of the meeting, and but please don't leave. We have some coffee and tea and crumpets back there, and but also, would you please come up and take a look at these pictures? Try to get yourself orientated here and see what this was taken. This picture was taken in 1939. Who said that?
That was a good year.
Yeah, thank you. I knew that. And I like that picture because we just get the train going through. And but there's also, if anyone knows anything about the Bethel Church, I'd like to hear someone tell me what they know about the Bethel Church. And also, this was, I believe, was Bud Moore's house on the corner. Marion, or not Moore, Bud Ross and Marion. And next to them, there was a place where a couple of brothers had a church of some sort for a time. If anyone knows anything about that.
Yeah, the one with the pillars on the front. Here's a
Is
porch
that it?
with a couple
Just
pillars.
this side of Bud?
No, it's two
Okay, I'd
down.
like to hear more about that.
It's two down from Bud.
Okay, I guess you're right, okay. And also, any stories you would like to share among yourselves here, as you're sticking around for a while and asking these fellows some more questions and enjoying the evening for a few more minutes, okay? Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you. Anna,
I told you that. When you walked into Roma's the other night, I said, I never even asked you how. She said,